What if Ned Stark survived? Ned Stark opened his eyes slowly, but the world around him felt wrong. His neck hurt, his body felt weak, and for a moment he thought death had already taken him. The memory of the execution still burned in his mind like fire. The crowd, the shouting, the cold stone beneath his knees. And then, darkness. But he was not gone. He tried to move and felt rough ropes around his wrists. His breathing was heavy. The air smelled of wet wood and salt. Slowly, his eyes adjusted, and he realized he was not in King's Landing anymore. He was inside a small ship cabin. The rocking told him he was at sea. Ned's heart began to beat faster. He tried to sit up, but pain shot through his body. Someone had saved him, but why and who? The door creaked open. A man stepped in, dressed in dark traveler's clothes, his face partly hidden under a hood. He looked at Ned with calm eyes. Not like an enemy, but not like a friend either. "You're awake sooner than I expected," the man said. Ned's voice was weak but firm. "Where am I?" The man closed the door behind him. Far from King's Landing, far from death. Ned's eyes narrowed. "I was sentenced. I was executed." A faint smile crossed the man's face. "Publicly, yes." Ned tried to make sense of it. "Then I am supposed to be dead." "You were supposed to be," the man replied. "But not all men in King's Landing wanted the hand of the king to die." Ned's thoughts moved fast. Betrayal, politics, enemies everywhere. Someone had interfered, but who would risk so much to save him? "Why?" Ned asked. The man stepped closer. "Because the realm is breaking. And you, Ned Stark, are the only man who still believes in honor. Some people think the realm needs that, even if it doesn't deserve it." Ned struggled against the ropes again. "Release me." The man shook his head. "Not yet. You are not safe." "Safe?" Ned almost laughed, but it came out as pain. "I am alive only because of treason." "Exactly," the man said quietly. "And King's Landing will soon realize that too." Ned looked down, trying to steady his breathing. His mind kept going back to his daughters. Sansa, Arya, were they safe, or were they already prisoners of the Lannisters? As if reading his thoughts, the man spoke again. "Your daughters live for now." Ned's head snapped up. "For now?" The man nodded slowly. "Your survival changes everything. If the Lannisters discover you live, they will stop at nothing to erase the truth." Ned clenched his fists. Even tied, even broken, his strength returned in that moment. "Then I must go back." The man laughed softly. "Back? You think Westeros is waiting for you with open arms? The North may still love you, but the throne will hunt you like a ghost." Ned's eyes burned with determination. "Then let them hunt." The ship rocked harder as waves struck the hull. The man studied him for a long moment, then finally said, "You are more dangerous alive than dead, Ned Stark. That is why I saved you, not out of kindness, but necessity." Ned stared at him. "Who are you?" The man turned slightly toward the door. "Someone who wants the realm to survive what is coming next." Before Ned could ask more, the man left, locking the door behind him. Ned sat in silence, the sea roaring outside. His life had been spared, but the world he knew was gone. The Game of Thrones had not ended with his death, it had only changed shape. And now, he was no longer a man waiting for execution. He was a man returning to a war that had already begun without him. Ned Stark remained in that locked cabin for what felt like hours. Though time on the sea never behaved properly, the ship creaked and groaned as waves pushed against it, and every sound reminded him that he was no longer in control of anything. He tried to gather his thoughts, but his mind kept returning to the same moment again and again, the moment the blade should have fallen, yet it hadn't. Someone had changed his fate in the final breath before death. When the door opened again, it was not the same man. This one was older, with weathered skin and tired eyes, like someone who had spent too many years watching the world fall apart. He placed a bowl of water and some bread on a small wooden table near Ned, then untied his wrists without saying a word. Ned did not move immediately. He watched carefully, still unsure whether this was mercy or another form of captivity. "You are stronger than most men who wake up after something like that," the older man said quietly. Ned rubbed his wrists, feeling the return of circulation. "Most men do not wake up after something like that," he replied. A faint nod came from the man, almost respectful. "True, but you did, and that is why you are here." Ned did not touch the food yet. His instincts as a lord, as a leader, always came first. Trust nothing until it is understood. "Tell me who you are," he said firmly, "and tell me why I'm alive." The man sat across from him, folding his hands. "My name is Sir Alton. I served in the Crown's Guards years ago, before King's Landing became what it is now." Ned studied him. There was no obvious lie in his face, but lies in Westeros rarely showed themselves openly. "You betrayed the crown." "I left it," Sir Alton corrected. "There is a difference. I stopped believing I was protecting a kingdom and started realizing I was protecting men who no longer deserved it." Ned looked down for a moment, processing that. "And you saved me?" "Yes," Sir Alton said simply. "Not alone, there were." Ned's eyes sharpened. "Others?" Sir Alton hesitated before answering, as if weighing how much truth to give. "Men inside the city, men who still remember what you stood for. They saw what was happening. The trial was not justice, it was a warning. If the hand of the king could be executed without truth, then no one was safe." Ned's jaw tightened at the memory. "They called me traitor. They needed you to be one," Sir Alton said. "It was easier that way." Silence settled between them for a moment. The ship groaned again as it shifted with the waves. Ned finally took the bread, but did not eat it yet. His mind was already moving ahead, as it always did. "If I am alive," he said slowly, "then King's Landing will not stop searching for me. They will say I escaped. They will call it conspiracy." "They already have," Sir Alton replied. "Even before your body was cold," whispers began. "Some say you were taken by the North. Others say magic. Others say betrayal within the city." Ned exhaled deeply. "And the truth?" "The truth," Sir Alton said, leaning forward slightly, "is that the realm is standing on a nice edge, and your survival just pushed it." That statement hung heavy in the air. Ned finally broke the bread and ate a small piece, more to steady himself than out of hunger. His strength was returning, but so was the weight of responsibility. He had never wanted politics. He had never wanted crowns or schemes, but they always found him anyway. "Where are you taking me?" Ned asked. "The North," Sir Alton answered. "Or what is left of your influence there?" Ned's eyes narrowed. "Winterfell, if it still stands strong, yes," Sir Alton said. "But there are changes in motion. Your bannermen are divided. Some believe you are dead. Some believe you are dead. Some believe the Starks are finished. And others are already bending knee elsewhere." That hit harder than Ned expected. The North had always been his foundation, the one place he believed still held loyalty without corruption. The idea of it weakening without him was worse than imprisonment. "How long was I gone?" Ned asked. "Long enough," Sir Alton said carefully. "News of your execution spread quickly. The realm reacted faster than expected. Power does not wait for grief." Ned leaned back against the wooden wall of the cabin. The truth was settling in now. This was not just survival. This was aftermath. The world had already moved forward, assuming he was gone, and now his return would not simply restore balance, it would disrupt everything. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky. The ship tilted slightly, and water slapped against its hull. Sir Alton stood up slowly. "You should rest. Your body is not ready for war yet." "I am always ready for war," Ned said without thinking. Sir Alton gave a faint, almost sad smile. "That is what makes you dangerous, and also why they tried to kill you." He turned to leave, but paused at the door. "One more thing you should understand, Lord Stark. Your name is no longer just a symbol of honor. It is now a question. And questions like that start wars. Then he left again. Locking the door behind him, Ned sat in silence once more, listening to the storm outside. His thoughts turned to his children again, but now there was something else mixed in, something sharper. Not just worry, but resolve. If the realm had already begun changing without him, then returning quietly would not be enough. Survival meant nothing if it did not change the outcome. For the first time since waking up on the ship, Ned Stark allowed himself to fully accept the truth. He was no longer just a man who had escaped death. He was a man whose survival threatened the entire game. The storm outside grew harsher as the ship pushed forward through dark water, but inside the cabin Ned Stark felt something else building, something steadier than fear, something closer to purpose. He had lived his entire life believing that honor was enough to keep the world stable, but what he had seen in King's Landing had shattered that belief. Honor had not saved him. Justice had not saved him. Only hidden hands and unknown loyalties had pulled him back from death. And that truth unsettled him more than any blade ever could. He sat there in silence, listening to the wood groan under pressure, thinking not as a condemned man anymore, but as someone whose existence had become a problem for powerful people. Hours passed before Sir Alton returned again, this time bringing news instead of food. His face looked more serious than before, as if the sea itself had delivered bad omens. He did not sit this time. Instead, he stood near the door, speaking in a lower voice as though even the ship itself might be listening. He told Ned that King's Landing was already rewriting the story of his death, shaping it into something convenient. Officially, Ned Stark had been executed for treason and buried in silence. Unofficially, rumors were spreading faster than control could contain them. Some believed his body had been stolen by loyalists. Others believed the execution had been staged to protect him for unknown political reasons. And a dangerous few were beginning to whisper that the Lannisters themselves had lost control of the situation entirely. Ned listened carefully, but what struck him most was not the confusion in the capital. It was the speed of it. The realm had moved on without hesitation, as if his life or death was just another tool in someone else's story. Sir Alton then revealed something more troubling. The North was not stable. Winterfell still stood, but the loyalty of the bannermen was fracturing in ways Ned would have never expected before his imprisonment. Without his presence, power had begun shifting quietly toward rival houses, each trying to decide whether to stand with the Starks or secure their own survival under new alliances forming in the shadows. The absence of a strong Stark voice had created a vacuum, and in Westeros, vacuums always filled with ambition. Ned felt a deep unease hearing this, not because he feared losing a title or a seat, but because he understood what instability meant for ordinary people. War did not begin in castles, it began in uncertainty. As Sir Alton spoke, Ned's thoughts drifted back to Robb, still young but forced into responsibilities far too heavy for his age. He thought of Sansa, trapped in a dangerous court where kindness was often mistaken for weakness, and Arya, whose spirit would never survive confinement without breaking chains or breaking herself trying. The idea that all of them were now navigating this world without him made something tighten in his chest, not just as a lord, but as a father. For the first time since waking on the ship, Ned realized survival alone was not enough. Living carried responsibility that death had briefly removed. When Sir Alton finally left again, Ned remained awake. The storm had begun to weaken slightly, but the sea was still restless, as if mirroring the political unrest he had just been told about. He stood slowly, testing his strength, and walked to the small, narrow window of the cabin. The world outside was nothing but black water and shifting sky, yet even in that emptiness he felt movement direction. The ship was not wandering aimlessly. It was heading north with intention, cutting through waves as if guided by invisible understanding. Someone had planned this carefully, and Ned could no longer afford to pretend he was simply a passenger. Days passed, in a rhythm of silence, brief conversations and cautious recovery. Ned's strength returned faster than expected, shaped by years of discipline and hardship in the north. Sir Alton began speaking more openly as time went on, revealing fragments of the network that had saved him. They were not a single faction, but a collection of smaller loyalties, former guards, disillusioned servants, minor lords who had once respected Ned's fairness, and even a few spies who had grown tired of the cruelty growing within the capital. None of them had the power to openly challenge the crown, but together they had managed one impossible act, removing a man from his execution without alerting the world until it was too late. Still, Ned sensed something beneath all of it that was not fully being said. There was fear in their actions, not just loyalty. Something larger was approaching, something that made even political enemies cooperate in silence. When he asked Sir Alton directly about it, the man hesitated for the first time. He did not deny anything, but he did not confirm it either. Instead, he only said that the realm was changing in ways that old houses did not yet understand. Power was no longer just about thrones or banners. It was becoming something more unstable, something that could not be controlled by tradition alone. That answer stayed with Ned long after Sir Alton left him alone again. He began to realize that his survival might not have been an act of mercy at all, but a response to a larger shift in the world. If the Game of Thrones had once been about who sat on the Iron Throne, it was now becoming about who could survive the breakdown of everything surrounding it. His return to the north would not simply be a homecoming. It would be the beginning of something far more dangerous, because now he was not just a lord returning from captivity. He was a living contradiction to a story the realm had already accepted as truth. One evening, as the ship finally began to slow near colder waters, Sir Alton returned with a final instruction. They were approaching a hidden port controlled by allies who would not question Ned's presence. From there, travel northward would continue by land, away from major roads and watchful eyes. Ned listened carefully, but this time he did not feel confusion or shock. Instead, he felt clarity forming inside him. The north was waiting, fractured and uncertain, but still alive. And somewhere within it, his children were trying to hold pieces of a collapsing world together. As the ship turned toward its final approach, Ned Stark understood something simple but irreversible. His story had not ended on that execution platform. It had only been interrupted. And now, as he prepared to step back into a realm that believed him dead, he was no longer returning as a prisoner or even as a survivor. He was returning as a disruption to every plan that had already begun without him. The ship finally reached the hidden port just before dawn, when the sky was still gray and uncertain, like the world itself had not decided what kind of day it wanted to become. Ned Stark stood at the edge of the deck as the vessel slowed, feeling the cold air of the north cut through him in a way that reminded him he was still alive in a world that had already written him as dead. The shoreline ahead was not grand or welcoming. It was quiet, scattered with jagged rocks and half-frozen waters, a place meant for secrecy rather than arrival. Men moved in silence along the dock, their faces partially hidden under hoods and cloaks, watching the ship approach without ceremony. There were no banners, no signals of loyalty, only the quiet tension of people who understood that survival depended on invisibility. When Ned stepped onto the wooden dock, he felt the weight of the land beneath him more strongly than he expected. It was not just physical, it was emotional, as if the north itself recognized him in a way the sea had not. Sir Alton followed behind him, speaking little now, only guiding him forward through narrow paths between crates and storage huts that looked abandoned but were clearly not. They were taken to a small shelter carved into the edge of a cliff where warmth from a fire waited inside. It was there that Ned finally saw the full extent of the network that had saved him. Men and women of different ranks, some wearing remnants of armor, others dressed like merchants or laborers, all gathered not as soldiers of a kingdom, but as fragments of something unspoken. None of them bowed deeply, but none of them looked away either. It was respect mixed with caution, as if they were unsure whether the man they had risked everything for would still be the same Ned Stark they remembered. One of them stepped forward, a woman with sharp eyes and a calm expression that suggested she had spent years reading danger before it arrived. She spoke first, telling Ned that the North had not collapsed, but it had fractured into competing centers of loyalty. Winterfell remained the symbolic heart, but the surrounding regions were beginning to act independently, making decisions based on survival rather than unity. She explained that without Ned's presence, his bannermen had stopped waiting for guidance and started interpreting silence as permission. Some were preparing defenses, others were negotiating quietly with southern houses, and a few had already begun treating the Stark name as a fading influence rather than a ruling force. Ned listened carefully, absorbing every detail without interruption, because he understood that in times of instability, information was more valuable than anger. What struck him most was not betrayal, but adaptation. The North was not breaking out of cruelty or rebellion. It was breaking out of fear. Fear of what the South was becoming, fear of the Crown's unpredictability, and fear that the old rules of honor and loyalty were no longer enough to guarantee survival. Ned realized then that his absence had not just created a power gap, it had created doubt. And doubt was far more dangerous than open war. After the meeting, Ned was given time alone near the fire. The warmth did little to settle his thoughts. Instead, it sharpened them. He thought of Robb again, now forced into a position he was never fully prepared for, carrying the burden of leadership without the guidance of his father. He thought of Sansa, trapped in a court where survival required masks and silence, and Arya, whose spirit would likely reject any structure imposed upon her. Each thought added weight to his purpose, but also clarity. If he had returned to life, then life itself had given him a responsibility he could no longer deny. The North was not just land and banners. It was people trying to hold on to identity while the world around them shifted too quickly to understand. Later that night, Sir Alton returned with news that changed the direction of everything. The capital had begun tightening control over information. Orders had been sent to increase surveillance across major routes leading north, especially trade paths and military roads. Someone in King's Landing had begun to suspect that Ned Stark's death had not been as clean or final as they had claimed. Whether it was paranoia or intelligence did not matter anymore. What mattered was that attention was turning northward, and attention always brought danger. Ned understood immediately that time was no longer on their side. The longer he remained hidden, the higher the risk that discovery would bring war directly to the fragile balance already forming in the north. That night, sleep did not come easily. Ned lay near the fire while others rested around him, listening to the wind pressing against the cliffs outside. His mind was no longer trapped in confusion or shock. It was now focused entirely on what needed to be done. Survival had shifted into strategy. Strategy was now turning into preparation, and preparation, he realized, would eventually become action. The question was not whether he would return to Winterfell, it was how he would return to Winterfell, it was how he would return without causing immediate collapse. By morning, decisions had already been made without formal discussion. The group around him moved with quiet coordination, preparing supplies and arranging routes that avoided known patrol paths. Ned did not question their methods. Instead, he observed, learning how deeply organized this hidden network truly was. They were not simply rescuers, they were planners, watchers, and survivors of political decay. Whatever they feared in the capital had clearly shaped their every action. Before departure, Sir Alton finally spoke openly about the true reason Ned had been chosen. It was not just because he was honorable or because he was respected. It was because his survival represented stability. As long as Ned Stark lived, there remained a possibility that the North could unite under something other than fear. His existence alone disrupted the narrative the capital was trying to enforce. If he was truly dead, then the North would slowly fragment into controllable pieces. But if he lived, even in secret, then hope of unity remained a threat. Ned did not respond immediately. He understood the logic, but he also understood the danger of becoming a symbol rather than a man. Symbols were powerful, but they were also easily manipulated and often destroyed when they became inconvenient. Still, he accepted what he had become, not out of pride, but necessity. As they prepared to leave the hidden port and begin the journey toward Winterfell, Ned Stark finally looked north with clear understanding. The land ahead was not simply his home. It was a fractured territory standing on the edge of uncertainty, waiting for something to either hold it together or push it into collapse. And now, whether he wanted it or not, he was returning not as a forgotten lord, but as a force that would either restore balance or accelerate the breaking of everything he once believed was stable. The journey north began quietly, almost too quietly, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Ned Stark traveled without banners, without announcement, and without the identity the world believed had already been buried. The road was not a single path, but a shifting network of hidden routes, forest trails, and forgotten crossings known only to those who had learned to survive outside the reach of royal authority. Each step forward brought colder air, harsher winds, and a deeper sense that the North was no longer the unified kingdom he had once governed. Instead, it felt like a collection of scattered memories of loyalty, still existing but no longer connected by certainty. As they moved through isolated villages and narrow mountain passes, Ned observed changes that weighed heavily on him. People no longer spoke of the Starks with the same confidence they once had. The name still carried respect, but it now carried doubt as well, as if it belonged to a story that might no longer continue. In small inns and roadside shelters, he overheard fragments of conversation that confirmed what Sir Alton had warned him about. Lords were negotiating alliances without Winterfell's approval. Trade routes were being redirected for protection under rival houses, and rumors of instability in the south were causing panic, even in regions that had once been untouched by southern politics. The world was no longer divided simply between north and south. It was dividing into uncertainty and survival. Ned rarely spoke during these travels. He listened more than he spoke, because listening revealed truths that words often concealed. He noticed how fear had changed people's behavior. Travelers avoided discussing politics openly, lowering their voices even when speaking of distant events. Even those who still respected House Stark did so cautiously, as if loyalty itself had become a risk rather than a virtue. This unsettled him deeply, not because he feared losing influence, but because he saw how fragile trust had become across the entire region. One evening, as they rested in a remote shelter surrounded by pine forests and heavy snowfall, Sir Alton finally explained more of what was happening beyond the north. According to his sources, the capital was no longer functioning with stable authority. Power was becoming fragmented even within King's Landing itself. Different factions were quietly competing for control under the surface of the crown, using misinformation, secret orders, and manipulated accusations to weaken rivals. Ned's supposed execution had become a turning point in that struggle. Some factions believed it was a necessary act of control, while others feared it had destabilized the political balance too far. The truth of what had actually happened to Ned Stark was now less important than how different groups could use his disappearance to their advantage. Ned absorbed this carefully, understanding the pattern too well. In his experience, kingdoms rarely fell from a single blow. They decayed slowly through confusion, distrust, and competing ambitions. His survival, unknown to most of the realm, was now part of that decay. Whether he wanted it or not, his existence had become a hidden variable affecting decisions he could not yet see. As they moved closer to more populated northern regions, Ned began to notice something more personal and more troubling. Fear was not just directed at the south anymore. It was turning inward. Northern houses were beginning to view each other with suspicion. Old alliances were weakening under pressure, and minor disputes that would once have been resolved through Stark authority were now escalating into silent rivalries. The absence of a central figure had not only weakened structure, it had changed behavior. People were beginning to act as if leadership itself was temporary. And that belief alone was reshaping how they interacted with one another. During one stop near a frozen river settlement, Ned encountered a group of local men arguing over supply distribution. It was a small dispute on the surface, but the underlying tension revealed something far more significant. Each side was not just arguing for resources, they were positioning themselves for future authority. When Ned observed quietly from a distance, he realized that the North was no longer waiting for leadership. It was preparing for the possibility that leadership might never fully return. That realization struck him harder than any battlefield memory. It meant that even if he reclaimed Winterfell, unity would not automatically follow. That night, Ned stood alone outside their shelter, watching the snow fall in silence. Sir Alton joined him after a while, but did not speak immediately. They both looked northward, toward the direction of Winterfell, though it was still far beyond reach. Finally, Sir Alton broke the silence by saying that Winterfell was not simply a seat of power anymore. It had become a question that different forces were trying to answer in different ways. Some believed it should remain the center of northern identity, others believed it should be dissolved into regional governance, and a few believed it should be reshaped entirely under new leadership. Ned understood that this meant his return would not be welcomed universally. even among those who once supported him. Despite that, he felt no hesitation. Instead, he felt a growing sense of responsibility, solidifying into resolve. The North, he remembered, was not perfect, but it was held together by shared belief in something greater than individual ambition. That belief was now weakening, and if it disappeared completely, the North would not simply become divided, it would become something entirely different. As they resumed their journey the next morning, the weather worsened significantly. Heavy snow made travel slower, and visibility dropped, forcing them to rely on memory and instinct rather than sight. The landscape itself seemed harsher, almost resistant to their movement, as if the land was testing whether they were worthy of crossing it. Ned endured it without complaint, his body hardened by years of survival in similar conditions, but his mind remained focused on the approaching turning point of their journey. Sir Alton eventually revealed that they were now entering territory where loyalty to House Stark was still present, but unstable. This was where Ned's identity would begin to matter again. If recognized, his survival would either restore hope or trigger immediate chaos, depending on who learned the truth first. That uncertainty was dangerous, but unavoidable. The closer they came to Winterfell, the less hidden Ned would remain, and the more his return would begin shaping events beyond his control. Ned understood that fully now. His survival had already changed the realm once. Returning home would change it again. But unlike before, he was no longer being pulled by fate or manipulated by unseen forces. This time, he was moving forward with awareness. Every step toward Winterfell was a step toward confrontation with a world that had already begun rewriting itself in his absence. And as the cold winds swept across the frozen land, Ned Stark finally accepted the truth that had been forming since the moment he opened his eyes on that ship. He was not returning to the North to restore what was lost. He was returning to decide what the North would become next. The closer Ned Stark came to Winterfell, the more the world around him began to feel like a memory that had been altered while he was gone. The roads were still familiar in shape, the forest still stood in their ancient silence, and the cold still bit the same way it always had, but everything carried a subtle shift in meaning. Places that once felt like certainty now felt like hesitation. Villages that once spoke openly of Stark protection now spoke in careful tones, as if even the walls might carry reports southward. Ned could sense it in the way people looked at travelers, in the way conversations stopped too quickly when outsiders approached, and in the way loyalty was now something tested instead of assumed. Sir Alton had grown quieter during these final stages of travel. Whatever confidence he had carried earlier now seemed tempered by the reality of how close they were to exposure. He explained that messages had already reached northern strongholds about unusual movements along hidden routes, though no one had yet confirmed anything concrete. Still, suspicion was enough to create consequences in a fractured region. Ned understood that perfectly. In times like these, truth was less important than fear of truth. A rumor could shift alliances just as easily as a sword could end a life. As they crossed deeper into Stark territory, Ned began to notice something even more unsettling than political tension. The land itself seemed more cautious. Patrols were less organized but more frequent, carried out not by unified banners but by smaller, independent groups claiming local authority. Some still showed respect when Stark names were mentioned, but others no longer reacted at all, as if the authority once attached to House Stark had become optional rather than absolute. That realization settled heavily in Ned's mind. Authority, he realized, did not disappear through defeat alone. It disappeared when people stopped expecting it to return. One evening, they stopped near a frozen ridge overlooking a distant valley. From there, Ned could see smoke rising from scattered settlements below, each one separated by long stretches of dark forest and snow-covered land. It should have looked like home, but instead it looked like fragmentation. He thought of how Winterfell once served as a center of gravity for these lands, not just politically, but emotionally. People did not only follow the Starks because of power. They followed because of stability. Now, that stability had weakened, and the effects were visible even from afar. Sir Alton joined him silently, standing beside him as they both looked down at the valley. After a long pause, he finally said that they would need to change their approach soon. Moving openly, even in disguise, was becoming too risky. Word was spreading faster than expected. and northern intelligence networks were beginning to overlap in ways that made movement unpredictable. Ned listened without interrupting, but his focus was already shifting beyond logistics. He was beginning to understand that his return could no longer be treated as a quiet restoration. It was becoming an event that the entire North would eventually have to respond to. That night, Ned did not sleep much. Instead, he sat near the fire listening to the wind move through the frozen trees, thinking not of strategy alone, but of consequences. Every decision now carried weight beyond immediate outcomes. If he revealed himself too early, instability could erupt before Winterfell was prepared. If he delayed too long, fragmentation could deepen beyond repair. There was no perfect timing, only choices that led to different kinds of risk. As dawn approached, their journey resumed, but something changed in the atmosphere. The land felt less like a passage and more like a threshold. Ned could sense that they were entering the final region before Winterfell's influence fully reasserted itself. Here, the Stark name still held meaning, but meaning alone was not enough to guarantee safety. It had to be recognized, and recognition was now uncertain. It was in one of these border settlements that the first real complication occurred. They had stopped briefly to resupply, staying only long enough to avoid attention. But Ned noticed immediately that something was wrong. The usual casual indifference of villagers was replaced by cautious observation. People watched them too closely, and conversations paused when they passed. Sir Alton noticed it too, and signaled for them to prepare to leave sooner than planned. But it was already too late. A small group of armed men approached from the edge of the settlement, not wearing Stark insignia, but carrying themselves with the confidence of local authority. Their presence was not aggressive at first, but it was deliberate. They asked questions about travel routes, identities, and purpose. Sir Alton answered carefully, maintaining the cover story they had prepared, but one of the men kept staring at Ned in a way that felt less like curiosity and more like recognition struggling to form. Ned remained silent throughout, his posture calm, his expression controlled. He understood that any reaction too strong or too weak could trigger suspicion. But as the questioning continued, it became clear that something had shifted. One of the men eventually mentioned recent rumors of unusual movement in the region, specifically mentioning the possibility that someone important from the south had been seen traveling north under protection. The way he said it was not certain, but it was not dismissive either. Sir Alton attempted to redirect the conversation, but the tension had already formed. Ned could feel it in the air, like the moment before a storm breaks. Then, without warning, one of the men stepped slightly closer and studied Ned more directly. There was a pause, a hesitation, as if memory itself was trying to confirm something it did not fully trust. Ned realized then that recognition did not need certainty to become dangerous. It only needed suspicion. Without escalating the situation, Sir Alton gave a subtle signal, and they prepared to leave immediately. The men did not stop them, but they also did not fully release their attention. As Ned walked away, he could feel eyes following him longer than necessary, as if something had been placed in the back of their minds that would not settle easily. Once they were far enough from the settlement, Sir Alton confirmed what Ned had already suspected. Their presence was no longer fully hidden. The network protecting them had been effective, but not perfect. And now, proximity to Winterfell meant that even imperfect information could spread quickly enough to become dangerous. That night, as they made camp in deeper forest terrain, Ned finally allowed himself to acknowledge what had been building for days. His return was no longer a quiet recovery from death. It was becoming an unfolding disruption. Every step closer to Winterfell increased the likelihood that the truth would surface prematurely, and when it did, the reaction would not be controlled. He looked into the fire, thinking not of survival anymore, but of consequence. The North he was returning to was not simply waiting for him. It was changing in his absence, adapting to uncertainty in ways that could no longer be reversed easily. And when Winterfell finally came into view, it would not be the same stronghold he had left behind. It would be the center of a region already preparing for conflict, even if it did not yet fully understand what form that conflict would take. Ned Stark understood then that reaching Winterfell was no longer the end of his journey. It was the moment everything that had been quietly shifting in his absence would finally be forced into the open. Winterfell did not appear suddenly. It revealed itself slowly, like an old memory returning piece by piece through the mist. At first, it was only the shape of distant towers rising above the snow-covered horizon, barely visible through drifting fog and falling flurries. Then came the walls, massive and weathered, standing as they had for centuries, but now carrying a different feelingless, like absolute protection, and more like strained endurance. As Ned Stark approached, he felt something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with cold. This was home, yet it no longer felt entirely like something that belonged to him in the same way it once had. The final approach to Winterfell was heavily controlled, though not in the unified way it once was, under Stark authority. Guards stood at irregular intervals along the outer paths, some wearing Stark colors properly, others wearing modified insignias or mixed symbols that suggested shifting allegiances. The discipline was there, but it was inconsistent, as if structure itself had begun to fracture into individual interpretations. Ned observed all of it in silence, understanding more than he wished to. A stronghold did not weaken overnight. It weakened in layers, and each layer told a story of pressure, fear, and adaptation. Sir Oldham remained close, guiding him through the final stretch with quiet urgency. He explained that they would not enter Winterfell through the main gate. That route was too exposed, too predictable. Instead, they would use an older access path, one that led through service tunnels and forgotten corridors beneath the main structure. Ned did not question this decision. He trusted logic more than tradition now, especially when tradition had already failed to protect him once. As they descended into the lower passages, the temperature shifted noticeably. The air became damp, carrying the scent of stone and old firewood. These tunnels were familiar in structure, but unfamiliar in feeling, as if they had been used differently in his absence. There were signs of increased traffic, hastily repaired sections, and new markings that did not belong to the original design of Winterfell. The stronghold had not remained static. It had been adjusted, altered to fit new needs and uncertain times. When they finally emerged into the inner corridors, Ned paused for a moment. The sight of Winterfell from within was both comforting and unsettling. People moved through the halls with purpose, but not with the calm confidence he remembered. There was tension in their movement, efficiency without ease. Servants, guards, and messengers passed each other quickly, speaking in low tones, always aware of time and presence. The castle was functioning, but it no longer felt entirely at rest. Sir Alton led him to a secluded chamber deep within the older section of the fortress, a place rarely used except in times of crisis. It was there that Ned was finally given space to remove his travel coverings and fully reveal himself within the walls of his own home. For a moment, he simply stood still, taking in the silence of the room. It was not emotional in the dramatic sense, but heavy in a quieter way, as if the space itself was measuring the weight of his return. Before anything could be said, footsteps approached outside the chamber. The door opened and Robb Stark entered. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Robb stood frozen in the doorway, his expression caught between disbelief and something deeper. Something that had not yet found words. It was older now, not just in years, but in presence. Responsibility had carved itself into him in ways Ned immediately recognized, but had not yet fully softened. There was strength there, but also strain, as if he had been carrying something too large for too long without relief. Ned stepped forward slowly. "Robb," he said quietly. The sound of his voice broke something in the room. Robb's reaction was not immediate joy or certainty. It was confusion fighting against recognition, disbelief fighting against memory. Then, slowly, the realization settled in, and with it came a shift that Ned could see physically: shoulders tensing, breath catching, emotions rising but not yet released. "Father, Robb said, as if the word itself might collapse if spoken too firmly. Ned nodded once. That was all it took. Robb moved forward quickly after that, closing the distance between them in a way that abandoned all formal restraint. The embrace that followed was not polished or controlled. It was raw, shaped by shock, relief, and everything that had been held back for too long. For Ned, it was both grounding and disorienting. He had faced execution, survival, secrecy, and political instability. But this moment carried a different kind of weight entirely. It was personal in a way that war could never fully prepare someone for. When they finally separated, Robb struggled to speak for a moment. His composure, so carefully built over time, was cracking under the pressure of impossible reality. "We thought you were gone," he finally said, voice lower than expected. "We held services. We believed it was done." Ned understood immediately what that meant. The world had not paused in his absence. It had processed him, adapted to his absence, and continued forward. "I know," he said quietly. Robb looked at him closely, as if trying to confirm that this was not a vision or a trick of grief. "How?" he asked simply. Ned did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced briefly towards Sir Alton, who remained silent in the background. This was not a story that could be explained quickly or easily. And more importantly, it was not just about survival anymore. It was about consequence. Before Ned could respond fully, the door opened again, and this time Sansa entered. Her reaction was different. She did not freeze. She did not rush forward immediately. Instead, she stopped the moment she saw him, her expression shifting through multiple layers of disbelief before settling into something more controlled, something learned. Ned noticed it instantly. This was not the same Sansa who had left Winterfell. This was someone who had adapted to survival in a world that demanded restraint over reaction. "Father," she said softly, carefully. Ned studied her for a long moment. He could see it in her eyes, what she had endured, what she had learned, and what she had hidden. He nodded gently. "Sansa." The silence that followed was heavier than words. 3 lives that had been separated by death, distance, and uncertainty were now in the same room again, but nothing about the world outside had returned to how it once was. And outside that chamber, Winterfell continued to move, unaware that its foundation had just been altered again, not by battle, not by politics, but by the return of a man the world had already decided should no longer exist. The silence inside the chamber did not last long, but it changed shape in a way that made it feel heavier with every passing second. Robb, Sansa, and Ned stood together like pieces of a story that had been torn apart and then forced back into the same space without warning. Yet nothing about them fit together cleanly anymore. Time had done what war could not. It had reshaped them in absence, and now their reunion carried both relief and distance at the same time. Outside the chamber, Winterfell continued its restless movement, unaware that something fundamental had shifted within its walls. Robb was the first to speak again, though his voice carried a controlled tension. He looked at Sir Alton briefly, then back at Ned, as if trying to understand the layers behind the impossible truth standing in front of him. He asked what Ned had already expected, how he survived, who was responsible, and why no message had ever come before this moment. Ned did not answer immediately because the truth was not simple enough to be delivered in a single direction. Instead, he chose to speak carefully, explaining only what was necessary at first: the execution, the hidden intervention, the journey north, and the network that had moved quietly beneath the surface of the realm. He avoided unnecessary detail, not because it was unimportant, but because too much information at once would fracture trust rather than build it. Sansa listened differently than Robb. Her attention was quieter, more measured, as if she was not just hearing the story but evaluating its implications. Ned noticed how she reacted not to the emotional weight of his survival, but to the political consequences it carried. That alone told him how much she had changed. There was no longer innocence in her understanding of courts and power. Instead, there was awareness, careful, restrained, and shaped by experience she had not chosen but had endured. Robb, however, struggled more visibly. His leadership instincts were still developing, and the return of his father disrupted the structure he had built in Ned's absence. For him, Ned's survival was not just emotional. It was destabilizing. Decisions he had made, alliances he had formed, responsibilities he had carried alone were now suddenly placed in question. Ned could see that conflict forming beneath his expression, not as rejection, but as confusion about where authority now belonged. Before the conversation could deepen further, Maester Luwin arrived, summoned quietly after Sir Alton's discreet request. His reaction to Ned's presence was immediate and restrained, but not without visible shock. Unlike the others, he did not question the reality of what he was seeing. Instead, he accepted it quickly, as if understanding that certain events in the North demanded acceptance before explanation. He approached Ned with careful observation, asking simple but essential questions about his condition, his time since survival, and his physical state. Ned answered briefly, allowing the maester to confirm what was necessary for the sake of stability. What followed was a short but intense discussion between Robb, Sansa, Luwin, and Sir Alton, though Ned remained at the center of it without speaking much. The conversation shifted quickly from disbelief to urgency. The reality of Ned's survival was no longer just a personal matter. It was a political disruption that would ripple outward the moment it became known beyond Winterfell. Luwin was the first to state it clearly. If word spread too quickly, the consequences would not be limited to celebration or shock. It could trigger instability across the North and beyond, because every assumption built since Ned's execution would collapse at once. Robb began to understand this faster than expected. He asked practical questions now, no longer emotional ones. Who needed to be informed? Who must remain unaware? And how long Ned could remain hidden within the castle without exposure? Sansa, meanwhile, focused on something different. She asked what their father intended to do now that he had returned. The question carried weight beyond simple curiosity. It was about direction, not reunion. Ned understood immediately that his survival had created a new center of gravity, and everyone in the room was now trying to determine how it would reshape their future. Before Ned could fully answer, Sir Alton stepped forward for the first time since entering Winterfell. His voice was calm but firm as he explained that hiding Ned indefinitely was not a sustainable solution. The longer he remained concealed, the greater the risk of accidental exposure. And if he was exposed at the wrong moment, without preparation, the reaction across the North could become unpredictable. Some would see hope, others would see manipulation, and others would see a threat to the fragile order that had formed in his absence. He emphasized that the North was already unstable, and instability reacts violently to sudden truth. Ned listened carefully, then finally spoke in full. He said that his return was not meant to undo what had happened in his absence, but to understand it. He did not claim authority immediately, nor did he reject it. Instead, he stated something simpler but more important. The North could not continue functioning under uncertainty. If he was to remain alive, then his existence had to become part of reality, not hidden from it. However, revealing himself carelessly would risk everything that had been built in his absence, including the fragile authority Robb had been maintaining. This created a difficult balance, and everyone in the room understood it. Robb was silent for a moment, then admitted something honestly, that he had been preparing for leadership without expecting relief, and now that relief had arrived, it did not feel like release, it felt like transition. Sansa added quietly that transition was necessary, but it had to be controlled, or it would turn into collapse instead of continuity. The discussion shifted from emotional shock into strategic consideration. Plans began forming in fragments. Ned would remain within the deeper sections of Winterfell for now, known only to a select few. His survival would not be revealed immediately to the entire castle, and certainly not to external houses. Instead, they would observe reactions, gather information, and determine which factions within the North were stable enough to be trusted with truth. Sir Alton would continue to manage communication channels outside the castle, ensuring that no premature leaks occurred. Luwin would monitor internal stability and assess how knowledge of Ned's presence might affect morale if revealed gradually. But beneath all of these plans, something deeper was forming. Ned realized that this was no longer just about returning home. It was about reclaiming coherence in a fractured system that had already begun adapting to his absence. And worse, it was about deciding whether the North should return to what it once was, or evolve into something new entirely. As the meeting ended, Robb and Sansa left the chamber separately, each carrying their own weight of understanding. Ned remained behind for a moment, standing in the quiet space that had briefly held the impossible reunion. Sir Alton watched him closely, then finally asked the question that had not yet been spoken aloud: what Ned intended to do when the truth eventually reached the world beyond Winterfell. Ned did not answer immediately. He looked toward the window where snow pressed softly against the glass, thinking not just of survival anymore, but of consequence. Because now he understood something fully. His survival had already changed the North once. Revealing it would change everything again. Night settled over Winterfell in a way that felt heavier than before, as if the castle itself was carrying thoughts it could not fully express. Ned Stark remained in the quiet chamber long after everyone had left, listening to the distant movement of guards, servants, and the faint echoes of life continuing as though nothing impossible had just happened beneath its roof. That was what unsettled him most. Not chaos, but continuation. The world did not stop for truth. It adjusted around it, slowly reshaping itself until truth either became central or disappeared again. He finally stepped outside the chamber and walked through the older corridors of Winterfell alone. The stone beneath his feet was familiar, yet every turn felt slightly changed, like a memory that had been retold too many times and slowly altered without anyone noticing. Torches flickered along the walls, casting long shadows that moved like silent observers. Ned did not seek direction, he simply walked, allowing instinct and memory to guide him through places he had once known without thought. As he moved deeper into the castle, he began to notice something subtle but important. Winterfell was not broken, but it was strained. Repairs had been made in multiple places, not all consistent with original craftsmanship. New guard posts had been added in unusual positions. Certain corridors had increased surveillance while others had been quietly abandoned. It was not disorder, it was adaptation. Someone had been restructuring the castle's internal security in response to threats that were not fully visible from the outside. That realization stayed with him as he reached the outer courtyard, where snow fell lightly under torchlight. A few guards were stationed there, speaking in low tones. When they noticed him, they straightened briefly, then returned to their posts without questioning his presence. That alone told Ned more than words could. His identity, though still hidden from the larger castle, was already beginning to shift within its inner awareness. People sensed importance even before they understood it. He stood for a long moment in the courtyard, looking up at the high walls and towers of Winterfell. This place had once been certainty. Now, it felt like a structure holding together under quiet strain, waiting for a decision that had not yet been made. And at the center of that decision was not just him, but everything that had changed while he was gone. Footsteps approached from behind, and he did not need to turn to know it was Robb. His presence had a different weight, now less uncertain than earlier, but still carrying the pressure of leadership shaped by absence. Robb stood beside him quietly for a moment before speaking. He did not ask questions this time. Instead, he simply said that the Northern Lords would eventually need answers. Not rumors, not silence, but truth. And truth, once given, could not be controlled in its effects. Ned understood that better than anyone. He replied that truth was never the problem, timing was. If revealed too early, it would destabilize what little structure remained. If revealed too late, it would lose its ability to guide change and instead become a trigger for chaos. Robb did not argue. He was learning, as Ned could see, that leadership was less about certainty and more about managing consequences. They stood together for a while longer without speaking, watching the snow fall into the courtyard. Eventually, Robb said something quieter, that during Ned's absence he had learned that people do not simply wait for authority to return. They replace it with whatever stability they can find. That stability might not be ideal, but it becomes real through repetition. Undoing it required more than presence. It required trust, and trust was far more fragile than banners or titles. Those words stayed with Ned as Robb left him there alone again. The courtyard felt colder after that conversation, not because of weather, but because of understanding. Ned began to see the true scale of what his survival meant. It was not simply the return of a man, it was the return of a question the North had already begun answering without him. Later, he met Sansa again briefly in one of the quieter corridors. She did not speak immediately, but her expression carried something more settled than earlier in the day. She told him that she understood why his return had to remain hidden for now, but she also warned him of something he had already begun to suspect. The court within Winterfell, those who managed internal affairs, supply routes, communication with bannermen, had already begun forming their own interpretations of leadership in his absence. Some would welcome his return, others would see it as a disruption to systems they had quietly built to maintain order. Sansa's words were not emotional. They were precise. She had learned how to observe people in ways that went beyond surface loyalty. Ned saw it clearly now. She had adapted not by resisting her environment, but by understanding it deeply enough to survive within it. That realization brought him both relief and concern. When he returned to his chamber later that night, Sir Alton was waiting. He reported that external movement around Winterfell had increased slightly. Nothing direct yet, but enough to suggest that information about unusual activity was beginning to circulate beyond controlled boundaries. It would not take much for rumors to grow into assumptions, and assumptions into action. Ned asked how long they had before exposure became unavoidable. Sir Alton did not give a precise answer. Instead, he said that time was no longer a stable measure. It depended on decisions made by people who did not yet know they were making them. That answer was unsatisfying, but accurate. After Sir Alton left, Ned remained awake for a long time, sitting near the dim light of a single candle. He thought about the nature of survival, not just physical survival, but political and emotional survival. He had returned from death, but return itself did not guarantee restoration. In some cases, it only created a new kind of conflict layered over old wounds. He thought of the North as it existed now, fragmented but still functioning. He thought of Robb carrying leadership without preparation, of Sansa navigating influence through observation rather than authority, and of the Bannermen who had already begun adjusting to a world without stark certainty. And he understood something he had not fully grasped before. His survival did not automatically restore the past. It demanded a new future, whether anyone was ready for it or not. Outside, Winterfell continued to breathe under snow and silence, unaware of how close it stood to transformation again. Ned finally extinguished the candle and sat in darkness, not out of fear, but out of recognition, because now he knew the truth clearly. His return was not the end of uncertainty, it was the beginning of a new one.